We are back. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, should be working now.
Yeah, it looks like it's all back up,
Okay.
at least as far as I can tell.
Um, cool. So what were I'm sorry, you were talking about biological processes and such.
And their purposes, yeah. So yeah, I was just saying that I could see how someone would take the view that all the stuff that Sellars and Davidson and so on do in trying to provide an independently semantic, independently normative account of content is sort of a waste or is unnecessary in some sense because a biological teleology, which of course is normative in and irreducibly so, but a biological account of teleology, of say the purpose of our sensory organs being to track objects, say, would trivially get at give you a account of how it is that our thought has content. I don't know if that's the direction the person you were quoting or talking about.
Oh no, I mean I've never heard of this sort of teleological account as sort of justifying that our sensory organs are, aptly viewing the world. I guess the next question is sort of defining what teleology is for the audience, and then giving an account for why we need purposefulness in biology. I certainly think that we do have sort of purposefulness within biology. Oh, hold on, I need to turn up the.
Oh yeah, I'm apparently not able to be heard.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, there we go.
Hopefully that's better.
Yeah, yeah, I think I just turned you up. You should be good. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know. I think it just reset my entire my philosophy thing. I'm just gonna have to probably do this real quick. So yeah, so on the issue, uh, since John basically mentioned that one way that we can justify that our sense organs are working appropriately is to say that they're working in accordance with their nature to a fulfilled, purposeful end. So if the
Mm-hmm.
eyes were meant to see things, right, if the organ was purposefully made in order to accommodate for that type of skill, then we would be right in our justification to refute the skeptic who thinks that our sense organs are maladaptive or that they're not conducive towards seeking truth in a certain type of way, right? But this would require us to move ourselves from the general idea of evolution as sort of being natural selection, like making sort of random natural selections depending on the environment that aren't conducive to the idea that necessarily that they're made for finding out how things are correctly viewing the world, but we should instead move from that type of framework to a more purposeful framework. Although yours might be compatible with evolution, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of teleology being compatible with evolution, just sort of revisiting evolution in a different way, might be the direction that we want to talk to. So, I mean, do you have a sort of
Mm-hmm.
robust argument here for why we should view organisms or our biology or our organs as being teleological? I'm guessing you're going to go to Michael Thompson or whatever his name was.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think a good example for this, at least this, of course, like any argument, there are ways, it's not knocked down and there are ways around it, but a particularly, I think, strong case here is to think about how it is that we identify a particular living thing as an individual member of a species, and to see the way in which we can't do that other than by reference to the purposes for which the biochemical processes in that organism are operating. Which is, to put that another way, we could we would have a robust argument for biological teleology if it's the case that even identifying something as a living thing, as opposed to simply chemical processes, uh, you know, proceeding in one way rather than another, and moreover, to even be able to identify what amongst living things is specifically an individual as opposed to say, if I think of myself, I'm an individual human, but I'm made up of trillions of cells. And so how is it that I can identify me as an individual human as opposed to merely a myriad of different cells? And so because that itself is to the extent that such identification is necessary from a scientific perspective, that's actually important that we can identify what draw a difference between, say, me as a whole human being, and say my some cells that have the same genetic material that I do, being a colony of human cells, basically, as opposed to a single individual. To the extent that that's necessary, we can provide a robust argument for biological teleology if biological teleology is necessary for doing that. And the example that I like to use for this is the example of HeLa cells, or the cells that were unjustly taken from Henrietta Lacks when she died of cancer, and that have been a staple of biological research ever since. Because if we look at a HeLa cell, which is of course a human cell, right? It's taken from this woman, Henrietta Lacks. There's a question with regards to that HeLa cell of whether or not we have simply here a part of a larger organism, we might say one that is currently dead, or whether or not we have a single organism, each HeLa cell being a single organism, and each collective of HeLa cells being a colony of those organisms, in the way that we talk about bacteria and fungi. I mean, we could I could use fungi as a similar example, because sometimes we talk about fungi as colonies, and sometimes we talk about them as individual organisms. So that would be another example. But focusing on the HeLa cells, we would be able to identify, actually, sorry, let me retrace that sentence. In order to distinguish a HeLa cell as an organism in its own right, from the same cells when they were in Henrietta Lacks' body and were just part of her being the organism. In order to draw that distinction, we can't appeal merely to the biochemical processes that are occurring. Even if these biochemical processes were identical in an isolated HeLa cell and the same cell while it was still in her body, it would nonetheless be the case that the cell that's still in her body, we could nonetheless draw a distinction between the cell being in her body and being just a part of her body and not an independent organism, the same way that I do for any of my cells, right? My skin cells are not, no, they're just part of me. I can identify them as part of me as opposed to being an independent organism. But in order to do so, we have to appeal to the purpose of those same biochemical processes, those biochemical processes that are identical in the in an isolated HeLa cell and in HeLa cells that were still in Henrietta Lacks' body. Namely, if the HeLa cell, for example, was taken from her pancreas, then we would identify say, a biochemical process which is producing a certain enzyme, and let's say that this process goes on both in the isolated HeLa cell and in the cell while in her pancreas. We would distinguish the cell in her pancreas as only part of an organism as opposed to an independent organism in its own right, by saying that the purpose of the production of that enzyme is to provide that enzyme to further biochemical processes in the larger organism. Whereas in the case of the isolated HeLa cell, that process may be pointless, it may have no purpose, or it perhaps has the purpose of sustaining some further biochemical process in the HeLa cell, which is required for it to continue to be alive. But nonetheless, whatever it is, whether it's purposeless or has some further purpose, does not have the same purpose as the same cell or the same type of cell in Henrietta Lacks' pancreas. And so in order to do that, the argument goes, you must appeal to purposes in order to identify that difference between being an independent organism and being just a part of another organism, you must be able to, you must appeal to the differences in purpose. And so in that way, you have a sort of transcendental argument of a sort for biological teleology.
So can you quickly? So a Helios cell is just a human cell,
Yeah, it's a human cancer cell from a particular woman.
and you're basically saying that in order to differentiate between cell A that is in someone's body and cell A as being independent of someone's body, you need to appeal to purposefulness, in order to know its structure, its function.
You need to appeal to its function in order to its function or purpose in order to identify it as an independent organism. And the particular force of this example is that, in fact, that distinction is drawn within biological science. That this is a distinction to which biologists are committed. In the specific case of HeLa cells, and there's other. I could give other cases though too.
See, this is interesting. So I was reading. I mean, you already know that I've read the book, and I kind of went over some of the ideas with you on Everything Flows by John Dupree and Nicholson. And he mentions something
Right.
quite similar to this, although he was talking about pathogens and what sort of constitutes the identity of pathogens. I don't know how much this is going to relate, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
And something that we don't consider a pathogen, but a sort of microbe inside the human body. So he was basically saying that there's a sort of dynamic relationship between the microbe and it being constituted as a pathogen and sort of working not necessarily in repertoire with the system, but sort of antagonistic to the system.
Mm-hmm.
And that was decided by the immunity system, basically, in any sort of human organism. That a pathogen is only going to be a pathogen insofar as it's going to work not in repertoire, but as sort of antagonistic or as a sort of agitating force to the human body as a whole. And one that does work as a sort of repertoire with it would be sort of accommodated into the body, sort of not rejected by the human immunity system, right? It would instead sort of filter through it. And there are certain types of bacteria which obviously do this, right? They don't hinder us, but sort of also work in a sort of dynamic repertoire.
Indeed.
And you could say the ones that, I guess, if I'm understanding your argument correctly, the ones that are sort of antagonistic, right, would not be acting towards the purposeful end of sustaining the human body against illnesses, right? And the ones that do would be forming an identity with it and would be working from some sort of stated purposefulness, right? That is to keep the body healthy. So there are certain types of conditions where this pathogen or this microbe that's entering into the body can be considered a part of the identity or not a part of the identity, depending on its functional purpose there. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, I think that that's another very good example of where we need an appeal to teleology, um, to draw a distinction between pathogens and say gut flora or something like that. Although that said, I think that's a case, and I appeal to the HeLa cell case for certain reasons. I would expect that that kind of case, the distinction in particular between pathogens and microflora or whatever, would be one that could be argued to be merely a practical distinction, and that it's a distinction that we draw within the practice of medicine, and not to the extent that medicine draws upon a theoretical science of biology, but to the extent that the practice of medicine involves reference to particular needs that we as users of medicine and users of the services of medical services have. And so in that way, I think that that distinction is somewhat more vulnerable to a anti-teleological response in that way. But I of course think that it's a great example of
so I'm kind of
where
curious.
teleology is so important in our thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important in my thought. I mean, people call me crazy for this, but so what in your opinion then? Maybe I'm still missing it, and maybe this is a good clarification for the audience as well that's listening. What would be a good, solid theoretical distinction between this sort of criticism that you offered earlier, what would be a sort of solid distinction between a pragmatic case and an actual not pragmatic but ontological teleological case? I know you use the Hegel cell, but why are these like different? Why do you think that why do you think one is purely pragmatic, I guess?
I first of all would actually, I think you could be argued that the non-pathogen case could also be argued to be not pragmatic. I just see that as easier to argue from an opponent of teleology. But certainly the criteria that I have in mind for identifying merely pragmatic distinctions within a science and from the theoretical distinctions within a science is a contribution to the understanding of the phenomenon in question, and a need of that distinction for explaining the mechanisms at work inside of that phenomenon. And so we might see this as a way in which you get further commitments of a science out of a merely mechanistic picture. That, which is to say that insofar as you're identifying mechanisms in a phenomenon, in this case, biological phenomenon, say a human being, there are going to be certain further phenomena or further aspects of that phenomena or further entities or whatever you like, processes, which you appeal to in the process of understanding that phenomenon. And so insofar as you have to appeal to those further things, again, what entities, properties, whatever, processes, whatever, the science itself as a theoretical enterprise, not merely as an enterprise which can contribute to the solving of practical problems, but as an enterprise of understanding the world and what's in the world, that enterprise, that scientific enterprise, is committed to the existence of that entity, process, property, whatever. And so in that way, so I'd be looking for that, for satisfying of that particular criterion in an appeal like the appeal I made to helicells, or an appeal to teleology like the one I made with helicells, and an appeal to teleology like Dupree and, as you were saying, make in the case of pathogens and non-pathogens.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if they would say themselves that these are sort of teleological processes. They just kind of, they want to talk about at least identity. I affiliated those two, but they would rather talk about identity statements and what it means to talk about identity statements in terms of biological organisms. So just to read a few comments here. Agnes Domini says, sounds like an argument for intelligent design, though, purpose, meaning, teleology, all those terms. And this isn't necessarily true. One could imagine teleology and directed activity or purposeful directed activity as being not dependent upon an intelligent designer, but rather as being something that's imminently participating within the nature of some organism or within the nature of whatever type of being that you're talking about. And the distinction there, and I'm sure John here sort of agrees with me on needing to make a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic teleology.
Absolutely.
And the idea that extrinsic would be a god basically imparting a purpose onto the world, and the world was sort of lifeless and without purpose, and it would only have purpose if, God sort of projected it onto the world, or, kind of as if we ladle gravy on, on our mashed potatoes or something like that, right? So the idea here is to go to sort of a more Aristotelian view of where teleology is within the actual organism or the being itself. It looks like you got a challenge right afterwards. I'll read these other comments. David Berlinski has stated that we cannot even decide how to define species. A really good book on the biases inherent in classification and multiple models of historical controversy being debated is Kinda Schleimbinger's Binga's 1993 Nature's Body, if anyone is interested as regards to mammals. Have you heard of
I'm glad he brings that up. That's a great point.
Londa, not Kinda. Okay, she's a historian of science, FYI. He also says, but HeLa cells do not change the purpose when transferred into other people, merely their location, correct? They still do as intended, which is why they are transferred in the first place, yes? Question mark. I'm guessing that's
Yeah, these
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that's directed towards what I said about HeLa cells. And these are all really good points, and certainly the the points that I had been making do not require the ability to draw robust and non to draw robust distinctions between different species. And I completely agree that different species are like the differences between them are more a matter of continuous differences and where there's no natural joints, in other words, along which you can cut the distinctions between different species. And certainly the form of argument that I was presenting is not relying on the ability to draw these kinds of robust distinctions between species. And it more appeals to it appeals to a more basic distinction simply between living and non-living, essentially.
Right.
And the point of the argument is that not only the mere identification of something as non-living, as living, I mean, depends on appeal to teleology, which is not something that I got into in the argument that I gave with HeLa cells, but even at the individuation of organisms, of members of any kind of biological taxon, even that kind of individuation is dependent on an appeal to teleology. Insofar as HeLa cells do not change their purpose when transferred into other people, the idea here is that when you look at a particular HeLa cell, you can, despite a complete biological identity with, like at the level of biochemistry, I mean, at the level of the chemical processes that are going on inside of the HeLa cell, you can identify quite rightly, and I say you can identify, I should say, biologists draw a robust distinction between HeLa cells that are outside of the body. Not HeLa cells that are outside of the body, but between HeLa cells and other human cells, which is to say that they can identify HeLa cells specifically, among others, as independent organisms in a way that they do not identify other human cells as independent organisms. And it's the drawing of that distinction which is relying on an appeal to teleology. But of course, this means that you can a particular HeLa cells has these two aspects. It is at once identifiable in a real way, in a non-relativist way, as an independent organism, but of course it's also can be identified as a part of a human body. And the idea here is just that when you do so, when you talk about, let's say you talk about the same HeLa cell in Henrietta Lax's, let's say I put a HeLa cell into you, and I put it into just the right spots that it actually is contributing to your biological processes. I could, on the one hand, identify that HeLa cell as a part of you, which is to say, and I do that by reference to it fulfilling the purpose of sustaining your biological processes. So in other words, it playing a role in the form of life that you as an organism have. Or I could identify that same HeLa cell as an independent organism. And by talking about the form of life that it has on its own, and identifying the ways in which the same biochemical processes contribute to its form of life. And so in that way, the same cell would be at once an independent organism and a part of a larger organism. The same way that a book could be simultaneously a book and a doorstop at the same time. Something can be more than one thing at the same time. And that would be a way in which that'd be true. At least that'd be true in this case of HeLa cells. So hopefully that addresses what you had in mind with it being a mere difference in location, because it certainly goes far beyond that. It's about the indispensable role played by appeal to teleology in drawing the distinction whether or not the object is located in inside or outside an organism.
So just kind of moving on to this next statement. So where do you each situate yourself in the chat, which Marty shared about Kant's interpretation?
Oh yeah, the chart.
Yeah, bringing up that chart, I guess we can go over some of these differences between us. Although I will say that John's a way better Kantian scholar than I am, so well, it might not matter in the end though, because we just have different. Let me pull up the interpretations again real quick, because it might not matter, because this is just what our metaphysical systems end up being and how they're distinct.
Yeah, certainly I fall under an anti-phenomenalist metaphysical reading of Kant.
Yeah, so let's just expand this real quick and let's get rid of these. So I think we both hold like an identity theory, right? And
yeah.
You would hold on to and I'd have to think about all these things again, because it's been a while since I've kind of thought about too many of them.
Should I explain the differences between the different positions? That might help a little bit.
Yeah, if you want to, for the audience, in terms of the interpretations, and kind of, I guess, give them a breakdown of what we're exactly looking at to even begin with, right? Before we get too far into what it even means to interpret it.
All right. So, I mean, the phenomenalist, anti-phenomenalist distinction is one that we've been talking about quite a lot before. It's just the distinction between whether or not phenomena, the objects of experience, and the objects that we experience are items in the mind. They're just ideas in the head, or some sort of object that only exists as a mental object, in the way that, say, Barkley's ideas exist, in the way that the constructions out of sense data of Carnap exist, in the way that mental representations as we normally think of them exist. The sort of Cartesian picture of all you have access to are mental images, and those mental images are separate from the things that they represent, they are images of. That would be a phenomenalist view, and then an anti-phenomenalist view would reject that by providing some account of how the objects of experience, the objects that we experience, are exist outside of our heads. Basically, it don't exist merely in the mind, basically that. Then the non-identity identity distinction, as I understand it, is the same as what's often called a two-world or two-aspect distinction, or distinction between those two kinds of interpretation, which is to say that a non-identity interpretation of Kant will claim that phenomena, again, the objects that we experience, are not identical to things in themselves or to noumena. So these things whose existence in itself can be identified through the operation of the understanding. I won't get too much into what noumena are, but the crucial thing here is phenomena, or I should say more appearances, since in this context doesn't actually matter, but the non-identity claim is the claim that appearances and things in themselves are radically different. They are not the same things, basically. Whereas an identity claim, and that might seem to be obvious for a lot of people who have read Kant, that certainly that was the prevailing view up until about the 80s, 90s. 90s is really where that starts to, where there's a sort of sea change in Kant scholarship on this point. But the identity view, or two-aspect interpretation, makes the claim that appearances are just the way that things, which exist independently and in themselves, appear to us. Or to put that another way, we have the objects of experience, and they are appearances on Kant's view, and those same things have a way that they are in themselves. And so there's an identity between appearances and things in themselves. It is the same thing which appears to us that also has a way that it is in itself. And so that's the identity interpretation of Kant. Finally, this epistemic metaphysical one is a little bit trickier, but it has to do with the a priori conditions of the possibility of experience that Kant identifies, things like the categories, things like space and time as forms of intuition. And it has to do with whether or not those conditions are epistemic conditions. In other words, are they merely constraints or requirements on what counts as knowledge, or are they metaphysical conditions, which is to say that they are conditions for the existence of the objects of experience.
So
a lot more could be said about that, but yeah, that's basically how the distinctions shake out.
yeah, so I mean, some of the things that maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe you could tell me some of the things that aren't hashed out in this table. It seems to me is whether we're non-conceptualists about content or conceptualists about content. Um, that seems to be sort of another thing altogether. I mean, we don't even have
Yeah.
like McDowell or Sellars or any of their interpretations of it. But this seems to be the only real, if even if I disagree with you, I'm not really sure about Kant specifically, that the content of our experience is always already conceptual for Kant, or it has some sort of non-conceptual structure to it, not necessarily within our experience, but how the world is. And I think, if I understand your position correctly, John, all of our experiences are always already structured conceptually, but you think that the nature of intuition, uh, as if it was a component that's independent of the synthesis with concepts, does exist in the world, and this is just a sort of structure that's there, that the world isn't just inherently intelligible, but that it's non-conceptual to begin with and that we make it intelligible? Or is your description a little bit different from that?
It is a bit different than that, but certainly the first part of what you said does is my view that there are intuitions as a kind of content which is non-conceptual.
Okay. So to me, I always kind of adjacent these two sort of views, right? To me, I sort of ask the question, what would it mean to say that the world isn't conceptual or intelligible? Because that's what I take conceptual content to mean, that the world has already these sort of sets of rational determinations, and then they kind of come to our experiences and we judge them, but we don't necessarily give them structure towards our cognitive capacities. Rather, that their structure is something that we slowly begin to understand dialectically throughout history. Um, that we don't just seep in intelligibility into the world, but rather that the world is sort of intelligible, and that comes towards our experiences. But where I think this is distinct from the naive realist view is that I do think that it sort of seeps into us, if you will, incrementally, right, as a sort of developmental process, generally a historically developmental process, of where we can kind of conceive different forms of error and then restructure what it would mean to talk about the world. So I think where I agree with you in that there being some sense of a noumenon in at least this sense is that we all obviously don't have the world as it really is completely structured before our experiences at every single moment. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would think that we know everything about the world when we experience it, right? Any sort of object is obviously going to have something that's hiding from us in terms of the level of information that's there. But what I don't see is like anything in principle, I guess, being impossible, or there being sort of unknowns, like things that are in principle unknowable, or things that are in principle unintelligible to us. Are any of these things that you sort of disagree with me on, or where would you say that the disagreement lies, if not there?
Yeah, let's see. So this may actually end up getting into some of the places where I disagree with Kant and agree with you, but we'll see where this ends up going.
Okay.
Certainly, one place where I I mean, I completely agree with you in projecting the sort of naive picture of the world just coming equipped with a single, or maybe even just a few definite structures. Let's say just one structure, is that's often how it's put. Think like Ted Sider's writing the book of the world. There's just the world just is structured a certain way, and our goal as inquirers, scientists, and philosophers is to get at what that structure is, and that we can do that because our perception we can do that at least I should say to the extent that our perception of the world, our experience of the world, just receives or is a reception of that structure. And then that structure, the way we receive that structure can be clouded or distorted in certain ways. And then the goal of scientific inquiry is to both collect more of these experiences, which you can then identify structures we haven't identified yet, but also to get rid of the distortions that have been added onto the otherwise pristine and untouched and undistorted structure that the world has on its own. And I agree with you in saying that this receptive picture, this picture of our contact with the world and our experience of the world structure, is not that it's not true, because our experience, or the way in which we experience the world structure, is not merely receptive.
Right.
It involves some activity.
Right. It involves spontaneity. I definitely agree with you there. To the extent of what that spontaneity is, I'm not quite sure if that spontaneity involves our minds structuring the world through, the pure concepts of understanding. In at least insofar as the pure concepts of understanding seem to be something that's merely internal and not an ontological structure of the world, or or something that's just a relational property to the subject, I guess, as the subject giving it some sort of meaning.
Well, and certainly I wouldn't take that the view that you're opposing there either.
Mm-hmm.
I would not say that, and again, how should I put this? I would disagree with the reading of Kant, and I would also disagree with the philosophical position that the contribution that the subject makes to experience and its content, so the contribution that comes from the categories, say, or the forms of intuition, space and time, I would disagree with the view that those contributions involve constructing or introducing structure into the world.
Okay. Well, then they have to be discovered, right? Then they have to be a part of the content already of the world, wouldn't you say?
No, and that I think that alternative is one that I would also reject, because I think there is a bit of a middle view here. Mm. The way in which that works for space and time as forms of intuition is something I'll set aside, because it'll get into more details of this perspectivalism I was talking about earlier. But the way this looks like for the categories, at least, is that however the world is presented to us in this purely passive way, and let's say it's as how should I put this? Yeah, so however the world is presented to us in some purely passive way, we just perceive, we're like merely perceiving the world without any exercise of our spontaneity, any exercise of thought, any act of consciousness, as it were. However that the world presents itself to us, there is just such a rich multitude of structures in the world as it presents itself to us. Things present themselves to us with an indefinite, like a truly indefinite variety of different aspects. And in order to, if insofar as the world merely presents itself to us in that rich, varied way, we can only identify objects in the world. We can only identify individual things in the world, and individual mechanisms, individual living things, individual processes as well, any kind of individuation amongst that rich, varied set of structures, just a myriad of different structures, an indefinite variety of structures, is going to require that our way of thinking about that rich presentation of different structures or different this multitude of aspects, it's going to require that our way of thinking about that rich variety is itself limited to thinking about that variety in particular ways, namely in accordance with the categories. So that, for example, in order for me to look around me in the rich flux of sensations that I'm receiving passively, and in that rich flux identify a keyboard right here, or even identify this red surface on the keyboard, I would have to my thought would have to be structured according to a subject predicate structure, for example. So I would have to look at the red, and I'd have to identify that as the color, so property of a surface, namely the surface that surface on the keyboard. And were I not to do so, I would be unable to even identify that feature as an objective feature in particular of the world that's presented itself to me. And so I would be unable to identify that aspect of the rich variety of aspects that are presenting themselves to me. And that's very different though than, so none of that requires that I introduce that aspect, right? The aspect is in fact there prior to my acts of thought. It's just that what was already there is so richly varied that no one structure could be, no one aspect, no one object or property or anything like that could be identified except under, I should say, certain constraints, namely the constraints of the categories. So that would be a better way of putting my view.
Okay, so I guess, and I'm still not sure exactly where we disagree. So I would say that there are certain types of rational constraints, but these rational constraints are constitutive of the world, right? That the world has sort of rational constraints that it puts upon us instead of us putting rational constraints upon it. So what I'm going to be able to, in virtue of my judgments about the world, what I'm going to be able to say about the sun, the trees, the world in front of me, right, the heavens and the earth, is going to be largely determined by the rational constraints that are sort of not necessarily external to my experience, but within my experience, such that the content of my experience is going to be content of the world itself, and that is going to be, in my opinion, right, which I think is justified, already conceptual, right, already conceptual and intelligible. I'm guessing I'm not necessarily seeing where these categories are coming from, if not external or internal, where they're necessarily coming from in your view, and if they are coming from anywhere, right? Would you say that this is a historical process? Do you think that our categories develop, right? I mean, is there a sense of where, at one point we didn't understand Euclidean geometry, and then we could understand Euclidean geometry, we can understand the nature of space and time to, somehow show how the world is actually structured in a distinct type of way?
So let's see where I want to begin on that. So certainly I do think that actually, a better way to put this, the categories, for example, and again, I'm not going to talk about space and time because it's a different, I think they played, a different role and come from the subject in a different way, in that perspectival way. But thinking of the categories specifically, the place that they come from is simply that they are conditions for the identification of objects anywhere. So that something couldn't even be an object. And I mean object in a broad sense, which includes processes. Something couldn't even be an individual thing in the world, whether a persisting object or an ongoing process, unless it fell under the categories. And so in that sense, there's a way in which the categories are already in the world, because they are not something that, insofar as there just are objects in the world, they have to satisfy the categories. They have to fulfill the conditions that the categories present as conditions.
So, but this then seems to me to presuppose the idea that there is some level of conceptual content in the world. It's just not exclusively conceptual content.
Well, so here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because insofar as the categories are in the world, so insofar as there is conceptual content already in the world,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it is only there to the extent that the world is able to be experienced by human subjects or other subjects who whose ability to identify those objects in the world depends on consciously attending to how the world affects that subject. So insofar as we're limited, insofar as we're talking about that kind of subject as opposed to a subject who can really think something and it be true as an act of by the act of thought alone, that would be a different story. But insofar as we're talking about human subjects at least, and other subjects that are, as Allison puts it, discursive thinkers or have discursive intellects, then something cannot even be an object for such a subject, except if it falls into the categories. And so it's only those aspects of the world that fall under the categories, that it's only those aspects which can be objects of experience for us. And so in that sense, it's a kind of selection, we might say, that what's happening when we experience the world is that we are only able to have experience, and so only able to successfully think about those aspects of the world that fall under the categories, or in other words, the world to the extent that it falls under the categories or is structured by the categories.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely, I, and it's still this is a little bit obviously confusing to me. I mean, I definitely agree with you on on everything that you said there, right? That the world only comes in sort of particular ways towards certain forms of concepts of understanding. Um, I guess maybe the methodology would be distinct, and this is probably something that we're going to have to revisit in the future. But maybe the methodology is distinct, because I kind of use a Hegelian methodology when I'm trying to address what are the concepts, what are the sort of pure concepts or understanding or the categories of thought, right? I neither begin with the idea that these are subjective. Sorry, I don't begin with the idea that these are subjective, rather that they're sort of generated through a dialectical process that Hegel gives within the science of logic, that sort of self-justify themselves through this dialectical process. This might be sort of confusing to the people that are viewing, and I know you haven't particularly read the science of logic yourself, unless you recently have.
No.
But the idea is that these aren't mental notions. I'm not even sure if they're transcendental notions. I do think there might be a priori deduction, so there may be transcendental notions, but they're ones that are also incorporated into the ontological structure of the world. They're not occurring in any sort of individuated sense, and they seem to be, like I said, sort of immanently justified, and that's the sort of approach that I would take. So, I mean, we could go through that sort of dialectical process. That would take forever, right? But I don't really see a reason to sort of resist this sort of conceptual realist structure. And everything that you said there seems to be compatible with conceptual realism. And yet you seem to also be saying that everything that you're saying is compatible with what I believe in. So I'm not really sure where to proceed from there, if you get what I mean.
I think I do. I think the big question here to really see if there is a major difference between our views would be to see if there's a distinction between the immanent justification that you talk about through an immanent justification through a dialectical process, and a transcendental deduction as a way of justifying or validating these conceptual structures. Because if those two things are different, then that difference would be in many ways the difference in our two views. And I do strongly suspect that they are different, mainly because what you're talking about is historically conditioned, whereas what I'm talking about is ahistorical. That on its own is a difference, but
well, some of them are historical differences. So, oh, thank you for subscribing, by the way. Terrific. So, what I mean by historical, I should clarify. I mean a temporal basis for our logic, or for Hegel, the logic is basically how do the categories of our understanding come into existence, and they seem to do this temporally. That means that we understand certain types of concepts through more fundamental concepts, and we go through this sort of chain of reasoning that is, of course, a temporal process where, right, we can't just think of it all at once. We think of it sequentially, chronologically. So this temporal process of where we understand categories of thought, we start with the most primitive categories of thought, say nothing, becoming, and being, and then see how those develop into more concrete forms of categories of thought, such as reality, negation, the concept of limit, the concept of quality, the concept of quantity, the concept of essence. So these sorts of categories of thought are fundamental to how we understand life, right? They're very primitive conceptions. They're not specific conceptions like the concrete category of homeostasis or metabolism or redness or brownness or a mailbox, right? Specifically to talk about a mailbox, we already, or even color, right? We already need to have the category of thought of, say, quality. And to have the concept of the thought of quality, we need even a more basic concept, which is being and nothing and things like that, right? And so the Hegelian dialectic within the science of logic is basically showing how these very primitive concepts of understanding develop into a notion of these more concrete categories of understanding, or, predications. But among them, right, I think at least, is the notion of subjectivity itself, the notion of objectivity itself. So there's certain types of things of where we talk about being and nothing in these really primitive categories of understanding that seem to precede the very notion of subjectivity and seem to already be sort of ontologically structured in reality before we get onto more specific determinations. And that's where I think that these categories of understanding, or these sorts of, if you want to put it another way, actual rationalistic constraints, are actually constitutive of the very ontology of the world. They come to they have to come prior to any notion of sort of subjectivity or individuated experiences that may be, I don't know, relational or I don't know exactly how you want to put it in Kantian language, but maybe you could do that for me here. And that's the sort of process that I would be more acquainted with in terms of giving a sort of an ontology of the world. Does that make sense?
I think that a lot of that is beyond me so far, since I don't yet understand Hegel enough. But one particular question I had about that is about the way in which you were talking about these categories preceding further distinctions between subject, object, nothingness. Would you say that precedence that you're talking about is more than temporal precedence? It's not just that they precede in time. Is there some further kind of way in which the categories that you're talking about precede these other distinctions and other
So it's interesting because maybe even the language of preceding might be inaccurate here, because when we do this, we go about saying that, okay, well, before we get to step D and C, there have to be certain types of prerequisites, certain types of presuppositions that we have to establish. And therefore, even to talk about this, I need to presuppose something, right? We might structure our wording like that. And that's what we're doing in Hegelian, in the science of logic, in Hegel's project. But that's still a little bit inaccurate. That's only meant to be a sort of pragmatic tool of what's going on in Hegel's story and its picture. Because if we word it that way, then we'll have worded it to say that we already knew what the initial conditions were without doing the dialectical investigation, right? We already had our ontological horizons opened up in such a way that I know in advance what I needed to do in order to get to this point. And that's kind of how I think the transcendental deduction works, is that I see these categories of thoughts being within my experience, and then I proceed to find out what the conditions of that are, as if they needed to have one inserted to advance. Whereas Hegel's project seems to be a little bit different. It seems to say, first of all, give up on every single thing that you know about the world that you think that you know, because the skeptic is just going to rail you from the get-go and say, look, buddy, I mean, you're just presupposing X, you're just presupposing Y. So instead, we need to begin with a sort of, like, I guess to use a Hegelian notion, an epoche, right? We need to, or a Descartes, putting it everything into sort of suspension of belief, putting everything into sort of a radical doubt that we could possibly be wrong with it, and begin philosophy in a very presuppositionalist beginning. And then he wants to look at, well, what happens when we do this? We're acquainted with these things. We're acquainted with indeterminate being. And what is indeterminate being? It is that which, it's that quality of which has no contrast, therefore it really has no quality to it. It's qualitative, it's without quality, it's without content. It can't be contrasted with anything, so we can't give it determination. And it isn't mediated, which is one of the things that Kant does, is that he holds into this sort of discursivity thesis that everything that we understand is through a mediation with other types of beliefs, or other type of or with some sort of intuitive, sensible content.
Yeah.
And so what Hegel here does is like, no, let's even get rid of that. Let's look at pure being in its indeterminate form, without content, without anything. What do we see there? We see indeterminate immediacy. And indeterminate immediacy, because it has no determination, because it has no specific quality to it, immediately, from the very concepts that we begin with, immediately oscillates into nothing. Why? Because nothing also doesn't have any sort of determinations. It has the exact same content as being in this sense. They immediately oscillate into nothing because they have no definitive identity. And so we can say that, in a way, that these hold an identity, but also that they don't hold an identity. And this immediate oscillation, or this immediate vanishing from being into nothing, creates another category, imminently. No presuppositions are given, no preconditions are given. We see, however, through this very process of these oscillating into one another, when we investigate being, that the category, a new category, opens up. That is the category of becoming. And the category of becoming, right, when this category opens up, what do we notice? That something is becoming something else, right? In order to have transition, we need now to speak of determination. And determination then ossifies being and nothing into opposition. It actually makes contrast between those two, but only through the category of becoming. And so now we have determinate being and determinate nothing, not as actually vanishing into each other, but having their own settledness, their own sense of identity in opposition. And you have unity now in difference. The very notion and the sort of foundation of Hegelian metaphysics is unity in motion, because within everything, within Hegelian metaphysics, according to Hegel, contradiction ensues in this sort of way. And so these categories, right, originate until we get into the very notion of quality and limit and otherness, right? And that's when we can sort of introduce the notions of subjectivity, the notions of error, the notions of illusion, existence, and all these other types of nice categories. But this seems to be a dialectical process that I kind of wanted to explain, and I've explained the very beginning, in that sort of way, right? And that's sort of how I think that maybe we should begin our metaphysics or ontology, in this sort of immanent process. You could probably critique this in various ways, but I haven't really heard a very convincing critique. The other thing that you might say is that this is just itself a transcendental deduction, which I'm sort of suspicious of for the reasons that I just gave you. So does any of that make sense, or are we in confusion land, I guess?
Certainly, it's given me a lot to think about. I mean, and I have a lot of questions as well. In particular, I wonder, is this presuppositionless starting point that you're talking about what the Hegelians call natural consciousness? Is that what you're thinking? It's
Well,
the starting point for the dialectic?
So natural consciousness, that's in the phenomenology of spirit. I'm talking about the
Yeah.
science of logic. But natural consciousness within the phenomenology of spirit sort of doesn't do ontology as much as epistemology. So if I recall
Mhm.
correctly, and this is more for Hegelian experts to sort of unfold, but I talked to one such Hegelian expert, and that he thinks that within the encyclopedia, um, we have if we also want to include the phenomenology of spirit, which some people won't include in the encyclopedia, but as sort of
Mhm.
perpeutic to it, we
Mhm.
have four different starting points for how we can begin in philosophy, and each of them are actually eminently justified. So, if we want to begin with the phenomenology of spirit, we can begin with the sort of epistemological view. We can begin with natural consciousness, begin with sense certainty, and then see how sense certainty, for those of you who don't know what sense certainty is, it's their sort of immediate beginning point that's non-conceptualized, right? Imagine we're just aware of the world, and then we're not even mediating it through conscience, through any categories of understanding. We move from that right state of natural consciousness into more developed categories within the epistemology of the phenomenology of spirit. But that's a little bit different from doing the science of logic, where we're doing more of like an ontological project on the structure of the actual world itself and what types of categories are there instead of for the subject. But then Hegel also has another type of dialectic um, that occurs within nature, and there he'll show the a priori conditions of nature. And Kant also sort of does this in the sciences. He shows us the a priori conditions of what matter is. He thinks that matter isn't just given. He thinks that it's going to have certain types of preconditions as well, as a certain type of transcendental dialectic. But for Hegel, right, there's going to be an imminent unfolding of some sort of dialectical process, I'm sure, as well. I haven't read his nature. I just know the
Mhm.
sort of narrative behind this. So yeah, so I mean, they have similarities to them, but they're also, you know, their own separate giant systems that are interrelated, interlocked, but distinct in a way. Kind of like a dual aspect about about a multi
Mhm.
aspect about our entire metaphysical system, because Hegel's system is just a monolith.
And so what is, this is a naive question, but what is the difference between sense certainty for Hegel and indeterminate immediacy for Hegel?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is a. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to think about that. It's not even a naive question. It's a good question, because then I would have to try to differentiate between the science of logic and the phenomenology. And the first thing that I kind of think why they're distinguished is because we have different categories in both of them. They kind of developed into
Mhm.
different directions, but they might be two ways of talking about the same beginning, if I was to prematurely kind of say something about that.
Interesting. Because the reason I asked that in part is because Hegel's sense certainty in the phenomenology, which again is part of Hegel that I'm only familiar with. I'm not really familiar with Hegel,
Mm-hmm.
but the sense certainty that he talks about seems to me to be very similar and to be pointing to the same aspect of our experience that Kant does in talking about intuitions and intuitive content. And if that's the case, if the idea here is that there is a development of increase of, let's say,
Yeah, but for Kant, right, you're not realizing a concept in intuition. For Hegel, you're realizing the ultimate foundational concept. That is the notion that Kant rejects as the intellectual intuition. He rejects that you get this immediate sense of knowing in any sort of um, in any sort of way, right? Because then you'd be literally God according to Kant. Whereas Hegel is basically saying, no, in this beginning, when we realize indeterminate immediate being, we are realizing a concept. We're realizing the most immediate and indeterminate concept, indeterminate immediate being. And unlike for Kant, and we've already talked about this, and unlike for Kant, right, intuition for him is always structured in space and time. But for Hegel, this immediate indeterminate being doesn't even presuppose space and time. It's an immediate recognition and sort of intellectual intuition of the most primitive type of concept, and then builds upon itself later on. And notice that there is no separation right here between the content and the concept, right? Because there can't be. There can't be a distinction between those two, such as the one that sort of Kant gives. Um, and so
So
here we're
that,
beginning with conceptual content.
yes, perhaps these two approaches are different dialectically or historically, but I wonder if that's attributing to Kant a much sharper separation between intuitions and concepts than he in fact appeals to. Because he certainly appeals to a very sharp separation between the two, but he's separating them as different aspects of the same thing. And insofar as he's doing that, he is not saying that they're just these two, basically that concepts are just tacked on to intuitions and there's some extra thing that
No,
then
but
has nothing in common with intuitions in any way. These concepts only apply to intuitions insofar as they're, as he says, homogeneous with the intuitions, right? Insofar as they stand under these further conditions of the transcendental schemata. And insofar as they stand under those further conditions, these concepts have a sort of immanent content to them. They have a content which is directly intuitive content and finds its place in intuition rather than in something else. And so, in that way, I wonder whether or not Kant's view is so different from what you're describing as Hegel's view, just because, at least to this extent, obviously there are huge differences, like the
yeah,
space time one that you mentioned.
yeah, the
But
space time seems to be one of them that I've noticed talking to you, and I've kind of been, I think we may be both sort of trying to figure out the sort of differences between these two systems. And there are going to be people like Beiser who basically says, well, there is really no difference once you take
mm,
the sort of robustly realistic view or the sort of metaphysical realist view of Kant. But I'm definitely not seeing and surely here you would agree, this dialectic within Kant, right? There just does seem to be
yeah.
what him looking at these experiences and then looking at what are the fundamental notions that are presupposed by these experiences instead of these things being imminently discovered or discovered, right? Or you're getting over the cover basically.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as there isn't that dialectic, I would at least say that it's because for Kant at most, if Kant is similar to Hegel as we're wondering, there is basically a one-step dialectic for Kant where you go from experience as it is sort of as we naively have it to categories of the conditions of the possibility of experience, and that's a sort of one-step identification of the categories imminently in experience. And so I wonder if the fact that there isn't that whole dialectical process is not there's no clear steps basically there's not a stages of finding one set of categories and then finding a further set of categories at different stages, and there isn't that in Kant for sure. That's a difference from Hegel for sure, but I wonder if that difference can be understood without saying that Kant doesn't find the categories imminently in experience, because I think to the extent that you're claiming that is a difference between Hegel and Kant, I'm not actually so sure about that. I think the categories are only able to be identified through a transcendental deduction precisely because they are there in experience already prior to um, having gone through that process of deducing them, or rather they emerge directly out of a careful attending to experience and what's there, a sort of consciousness of what is already there in experience. Does that seem to make them more similar?
Yeah,
Or is that
sure, but then it got me into another thought that I'm wondering how much of Kant would endorse a develop. Oh, sorry, someone's at my door. I'll be right back. You can talk about this just a little bit longer. It's not like I gotta get the door.
all right? Uh, yeah, I guess for everyone who's still in the chat, I mean, this has been going on for a while, so I may ask Marty to, if he's ready to finish up once we get over this last topic. We'll see what Agnes Domini, you've been writing a lot in the comments. And I have appreciated all the questions, although I'm sorry that we haven't gotten to them. Marty and I have sort of gotten been sort of stuck in our back and forth, which has been quite good, but I have been neglecting the comments because of that. So how does Let's see. So let's see. You're mentioned at some point much earlier. I'm sure that you'd posted this at some point during the discussion of transcendental idealism. How does that differ from Barkley and Solipsism? An item truly exists only as long as it is observed. Yeah, when Marty and I were talking about different positions on Kant, the sort of anti-phenomenalist positions on Kant hold that the existence of the objects of experience is unlike the existence of. Oh, hey, Marty, I'm just answering one of the questions in chat about how I assume. I mean, it's unclear when it was posted, but I assume about how transcendental idealism differs from Barkley and Solipsism.
So, one of the things, have you already answered it, or?
No, I hadn't. I mean, I'll just probably give this the short answer, which is that on an anti-phenomenalist view of transcendental idealism, the objects of experience exist completely outside of the mind. And even though there's a dependence on us having a perspective on them, they nonetheless exist even when we do not have a perspective on them, because of course they are just things that have a way they are in themselves, insofar as they are able to be experienced by us. So we might say that however the world is in itself, it is such that it will be experienced by us in a certain way, and the ways in which we experience it, and so what we experience of those things which have a way they are in themselves are just what we mean by the objects of experience, or just what a Kantian who's anti-phenomenalist and takes an identity view means by the objects of experience. And that's very different than Barkley, since the way in which something can appear to human subjects is something which is accessible not just to any one human subject, but well, I mean, so first of all, it's something which it's a feature of things in themselves, that they are such that they appear to human subjects a certain way. So it's different than Barkley, and it's different than Solipsism, which itself, of course, is different than Barkley, insofar as the way in which something appears to human subjects is, of course, accessible not just to one human subject, but in fact to any human subject. That's part of the objectivity of the objects of experience. So in that way, it's very different. I don't know, Agnes Domini, if you're still in the chat, but this is recorded, I guess, right, Marty?
Yeah, it's recorded. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then, I guess Agnes can see that at a later point.
Yeah, so I wanted to say maybe two other differences between Hegel and Kant that I've seen. One is in relation to identity, because any type of identity within Hegel is unity and difference, or unity and opposition.
Mm.
I don't think that's in Kant. I could be wrong. I don't think that that's in Kant. So whenever we have a determination of some sort, it needs to be in opposition to something that doesn't have that determination. So
No, perhaps that's not. Yeah.
then the second one that I'm seeing is, because of the pure concepts of understanding, there might be a certain ahistorical trend within Kant. And there definitely seems to be a sort of historical trend within Hegel, such that we're accumulating through the dialectical process. I hate using this term, but through the thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis, right? Going into sort of continuation of justification. Doesn't seem to be also within Kant, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I'm not sure if knowledge is a process for Kant. He seems to think that certain types of things are definitive. I do know another difference within the aesthetics, although in practice I'm not seeing too much of a huge difference between how Hegel has his aesthetics and how Kant has his aesthetics. So for Kant, he just does sort of drive a wrench between judgments of beauty as only indirectly taking us to notions of ethics or normativity. That is, it can only indirectly tell us what we ought to do. But for Hegel, that's the entire purpose of art, is that it actually not only does tell us what we ought to do, but that should be basically all the function of art should be to tell us what we ought to do. That it should basically further us as a humanity, to tell us what to do, because art sort of serves as a narrative, or as a sort of an image of what to do. So, like, right, I always offer this perspective. Sorry, this example of one viewing a painting of war, right, and that sort of tells us a narrative of the blood and violence of war, and that we shouldn't, be perpetually within war. That should be something that we stop doing. And in a way, art does this. Film does it even easier, right? Or books do it, like, fictions do it even easier. They can tell us about certain types of things of what we ought to do. But yeah, that I think that Kant just has a larger distinction there than a larger disjunction there than Hegel does.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Kant's view of what beauty is detached from ethical considerations, although not unrelated.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I do worry about that kind of moralizing of beauty, but that's maybe not the Kantian in me, but the Humean in me.
Yeah, I am actually more in disagreement with Kant. Sorry, but with Hegel than I am with Kant on that one. Although I
Mm.
although I do wonder whether Kant's notion of aesthetics is right, because I have deep apprehensions on this notion, although I'm at the moment agnostic. I have deep apprehensions of whether we can make any sort of determinate notion of beauty, or whether we should remain within this indeterminate notion of beauty that Kant offers us within the Critique of Judgment. Since I've read it now, it was a great book, but Kant basically thinks that any notion of beauty, that when we judge things to be beautiful, we can't get at a definitive, determinate notion of what beauty is. Rather, it's always the sort of asymptotic relation. We don't quite reach what beauty is. We have a super sensible notion within the noumenal or the transcendental subject, but we don't have an actual notion within the understanding. So that might be too abstract for people who haven't read Kant's aesthetics and all that, but yeah. We have been talking for quite a while, though, John. So I don't want to keep you here forever. Do you want to get here to the closing hours, because we are definitely down on viewers now. We had at one point 50 or 60 something, and now we're down to 12. So we should probably wrap it up. We've been talking for a while, and
I was thinking the same. Yeah.
maybe do this some other time. I'm sure a lot of people enjoyed it. It seemed like this discussion. I mean, I enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking
Same.
with you,
Yeah.
John.
That's
Um,
great.
because I did want to get some of your moral intuitions, moralities, something that, or meta ethics seems something that you're better than me at, and I might want to provoke you and provoke you in some ways to see what your challenges are to moral relativism and moral subjectivism and error theory, since those are interesting topics.
Yeah, I'm down to talk about that next time. Certainly, I'll mention, not as a reprimand, but simply as an observation. There was actually quite a lot that I didn't talk about with regards to skepticism about external objects. I only even touched on the distance problem. And I didn't touch on the aspect problem, although we actually kind of ended up talking about it anyway. And then any of the further ways in which transcendental idealism provides a solution to that. But I'd be down to switch gears entirely for next time to chat about meta ethics. That sounds great.
Okay, yeah. So let's wrap it up then with you, John. You have any other closing comments? Anything that you wanted to say, or should we call it here?
No, just thanks for having me on this. This was really fun. I
Absolutely,
enjoyed this.
John.